I will try to talk a little slower. I think your English is pretty good, judging from the conversations I've had in the past 24 hours. But I have a tendency to get excited and talk very quickly. I'll try to restrain that. As I say, it's an ideal situation to have the work around. And as a matter of fact, just sitting here waiting for the event to begin, I noticed a correspondence between these two photographs. And I thought, well, these curators know what they're doing here. This is very clever, the vertical and the horizontal geometry game. And it's a game you can play with Steichen over and over and over again, recombining photographs, and each time you do it, you make a kind of new language. You make a new statement. So sometimes I may suddenly stop in the middle of what I'm saying and say, oh, look at this or look at that, as I discover something new for myself even. So I wanted to talk about, not so much about the work here today, as to how Edwards Steichen came to be in a position to be invited by Mr. Condé Nast, the owner of Vogue and Vanity Fair, to become the chief photographer. At the time that the invitation came, Steichen was out of work. He was no longer an enfant terrible. He was no longer a 20-something. He was 40-something. He was recently divorced. He had a horrible marriage, really horrible marriage. It didn't help that he was having an affair with Isadora Duncan, but, you know, artists are like that. And he had two children, two young children, and you know what that means in divorces. And he had alimony to pay, and he had their education to think of, and he had no job. And even worse for his pride, he had realized he would never be a great painter. He was a painter and a photographer, very young. And in his 20s, he really maintained a career in both. He had big exhibitions in Paris and New York for his painting, for example. So he had decided by middle age that he would never be in the top level. He'd never be Picasso, he'd never be Rodin, who had become a friend. He would never be Toulouse-Lautrec. And he gave up his painting in a very dramatic way. He burned all his paintings. So imagine, unemployed, as I say, he writes to his sister a letter, and he says, I think I may even have to leave New York. I can't find work. Maybe I should try filmmaking. And anyway, the outlook is not brilliant. So my future is not brilliant. But luckily, he picked up a copy of Vanity Fair magazine somewhere, and there was an article about him in Vanity Fair magazine, and it mentioned about other photographers too, but he was mentioned as being America's best portrait photographer. And then the magazine said, what a shame that he has given up photography to become a painter. So they got it wrong. You know, magazines, journalists. So they got it wrong. And he wrote immediately to Vanity Fair, and he says, no, this is the reverse. And they called him into lunch. And at that lunch with the editor and Mr. Condé Nast, they offered him the job as chief photographer of Vogue and Vanity Fair. He was stunned, you can imagine, and he accepted, and he became overnight the highest paid photographer in the world, with a salary we think is more or less $1 million a year in today's dollars, and with a complete freedom to have advertising clients as well, for which he probably earned another $1 million or so. This was a very bad habit for those magazines to start, because people like Annie Leibovitz and Richard Avedon, and they said, we want that too. So my question was, how was it possible that Mr. Condé Nast, who was what we call a Francophile, he thought everything that was coming out of France was just the best, and especially fashion. How was it that he would employ essentially a provincial American immigrant. At 1 year old, he was taken to Luxembourg by his, from Luxembourg to Wisconsin by his mother, who had absolutely no money. How was it this provincial American would become this top fashion photographer, interpreter of fashion for women, for American women? Because that's what Vogue was all about. American women needed to be told how to be elegant. It's not genetic like for you women. You know, in Europe it's genetic. You get a special gene how to be elegant and dress well. But in America they don't have this gene, so they have to learn it. And they learn it by looking through Vogue magazine and then copying, right? And because everybody had sewing machines then, this is a big development. People had sewing machines they could actually copy. And for many, many years, Vogue's profits did not come from the magazine, they came from selling patterns that women could copy. So I'm going to tell you tonight, that's the preamble to my talk tonight. I'm going to talk to you about how Edwards Steichen came to be in this position of the right man in the right time in the right place in 1922. And for that, I think we should have the lights down. Can I wear my glasses and these things at the same time? Yes. So I'd like to take you back. I'm not sure I need this light. Good, perfect, okay. I'd like to take you back to Edwards Steichen in his very early days as a teenager. As a teenager, he picks up photography, and he's already very quickly in important salons in New York and Chicago and in Pennsylvania. So as a teenager, he gets a reputation, even to be written about in the local newspaper. The local newspaper in Milwaukee says, Mr. Steichen has already an international reputation. It wasn't true. He probably told them that because he was also a very, very good impresario. He was a very good self-promoter. And we know that, you know, as today, you go very far with that talent. His first photography was what we call, and you all know as pictorialism, because here in Austria you have a fabulously rich tradition of pictorialism, and you have the great Heinrich Kühn, among other people. And I just give you one or two photographs from this period. This is the famous The Pond, Moonrise, which sold about 10 years ago for $3 million. So it's the highest price ever paid for a photograph at that time. And you might start, I'm talking about millions of dollars all the time, you're going to start thinking I'm a money crazy guy. But it just means, I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that 100 years after it was made, it was still considered by our culture to be a milestone in photographic art. Whereas so much other of the pictorialist stuff has just disappeared and looks silly and overly romantic and so on. Steichen has retained his power. Another iconic picture is his picture of the Flatiron Building in New York. Still considered to be one of the finest examples of pictorialist photographic art. And as we will discuss a little later, he becomes this amazing fashion photographer. And he innovated something. He innovated fantasy, theater. These women are wearing, well, man and woman here are wearing masks by a Polish artist, Benda. They're wearing masks and enacting out a kind of fairy tale. We can imagine what it would be. In Vogue, it never said what it was, but we can imagine. And so he really is responsible for launching what we have as commonly now in fashion photography, which is fantasy and theater. And meanwhile, as I say, he was also a commercial photographer, and he brought to commercial photography this new, essentially European modernism. He was very connected with developments in Europe in photography, and he picked up on these, these fantastic diagonals and this very hard, sharp lighting. He had become a modernist in only a few years. He had jumped from pictorialism to this new, bold modernism. And he said, famously, he said, "I want to work like an engineer. Photography is a modern communication system, industry, and I want to work like an engineer." He was also a pioneer of color photography and a great innovator in the autochrome method, which, as you know, was invented in 1905 or 6 or 7, one of those years. And he did some remarkable work with the autochrome. He also championed the autochrome because it was a French invention, and Kodak tried to kill it. Kodak saw it as competition and tried to get journalists to write negative things about the autochrome so that they wouldn't compete with their own products, but it didn't really work. And he took fabulous pictures like this, uniting his interest in fashion and the new color. And I just thought it'd be interesting. I just found this the other day, an ad for Chanel. So I think, I know that the people in modern fashion industry are very aware of historical precedents and steal from the past, thinking that people like us won't notice. He was also in World War I and World War II, he was a combat photographer. And he was responsible in World War I for aerial photography for the Allied armies and stationed in France. And he developed, for example, a camera that wouldn't vibrate, because vibration of a camera shooting photography is not going to work very well. In the Second World War, he was responsible for something like 4,000 men working in the photographic department of the US Navy. And he was sent to the Pacific Theater. And then in his commercial work, he did some fabulous things. This was a design for dresses, for silk dresses. He was commissioned by a Swiss company called Staley Silk Company to do some new kinds of designs for dresses. He could do anything he wanted. And he said, okay, I'll take on the work, but no flowers. No corny flowers. You know, flowers are everywhere. Flowers drown our decorative lives, certainly. And he said, I want to do something new. So he did, in this case, matches and matchboxes. And here are 4 pieces of silk as they were actually printed. So the color is added in the, it's not color photography, it's black and white photography. The color is added in the printing on silk. These are jelly beans, threads, rice, colored rice, and buttons and threads. And these were actually made, we hope to have one for the show, but there is a dress at the Museum of Modern Art, but they won't lend it because it's too fragile. And in the 1930s, he was also commissioned to design several pianos. And he did these beautiful Art Deco designs. He also designed glassware for Steuben Glass Company. And then, during the Second World War, he was famous enough to be asked by the Museum of Modern Art to do 2 big exhibitions about, essentially, propaganda exhibitions about the war effort. One was called Road to Victory, and it had as its designer Herbert Bayer, the German expatriate who designed it. And this one was called Power in the Pacific with an American designer. And it was completely radical exhibition design. It's something you might see today in an art school, where he tried to give a sense of cinema by having the action, a film loop printed as individual images, hung in front of a picture, and of course this star, which is, the American star. So it's very propagandistic, but also extremely avant-garde in its, for Americans it was avant-garde, but in fact Herbert Bayer had pioneered these exhibition designs in Germany previously. This is not a history that's so well known. And then in 1935, he had an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art of his own flowers. So these are hybrids. They're actually called Steichen delphiniums. These are hybrids that he engineered. The blues had never been achieved in delphinium before, so that's a new color. And you can still order, you can go online and order Steichen delphiniums. There's one called Connecticut Yankee, because his farm was in Connecticut. And the moment he gave this work up, in 1935, more or less, I say more or less because his pictures kept appearing afterwards. When he quit, some of the pictures kept appearing up until 1937. But when he gave it up, he thought of becoming a full-time horticulturalist or full-time gardener. And he had five full-time gardeners working for him at that moment. But the Second World War came, and as I showed you, he then joined the war effort as a combat photographer and a supervisor of photographers. And he was also a modernist painter, and I think an extremely good painter. This is a Steichen from about 1922. Very good. I think any museum would be of modern art would be very, very happy to have that example. It turned out, he told everybody that he burned all his paintings. It turned out that he hid quite a few of them away. So it was another one. He was a good storyteller. And one of the things that occurred to me working on Steichen with Todd and Natalie, my co-curators, of the bigger show, this comes from a bigger show called Lives in Photography. This was a full retrospective of his life. One of the things that occurred to us was it was like dealing with the work of 7 photographers. You could imagine this huge show you have here being 1/5 of his work. You could have a show this big of his pictorialism. And you could have a show of his commercial work that was almost as big, and so on. So I began to see Steichen as this European, because he remained European. He remained European. He always was hesitating, should he be Edouard with the French E-D-A-O, or Edward with a W, the English, Edward or Edward, Edward. And he was a kind of bridge between Europe and America. He brought kind of European sensibilities to American photography, but he also brought art. He was a scout, a kind of scout for Alfred Stieglitz. And he brought Picasso, Rodin, Toulouse-Lautrec, Renoir, and at least a dozen other avant-garde European, George Seurat, European artists for the first time to show in his gallery, the gallery Alfred Stieglitz and Steichen ran together in New York. He brought them. Stieglitz stayed basically in New York. Steichen was the one who went out, met the artists, and brought their work back under his arm. So I began to see him as a bridge in many ways, and I just have a little list of these different bridges between the old world sensibility and the new, between Paris and New York, between pictorialism and modernism, between painting and photography, between photography and design. For example, he designed the logo of the famous magazine Camera Art. between the single fine print, like the ones I showed you, the Flatiron Building, the beautiful single print, and the mass-produced print on the a million copies of, or close to a million copies of Vogue on the printed page, a bridge also between art and commerce, a bridge between making art and curating it, because he became a very famous curator for the last 15 years of his career at the Museum of Modern Art. And he himself called photography ridiculously easy and impossibly difficult. Often when he talked about photography, he did it in these opposite terms, and that's why I like the metaphor of a bridge. Now, he himself photographed 2 great bridges in New York. This is another pictorialist masterpiece, and it's funny because to the sensibilities of us here, we would say, oh, this is an old-fashioned photograph. It's out of focus. But at the time, this would be seen as a radically avant-garde piece of art, because this bridge was brand new for 1879. It was a new bridge. It was the first bridge to have electric lighting. It was the longest span in the world. And the piers, the Gothic piers, were the highest structures other than the pyramids in the Western world. So this was like the space station today, you know, or the Airbus 380, whatever. This was like a technological marvel. And he shows that. And even, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the steel cable, you see that, the highlight? This little glint of, he tells us that it's a steel bridge. The bridge was so shocking to New Yorkers when it was opened that they refused to go across it. And they had to, the bridge engineers had to hire a Barnum and Bailey circus to make the elephants go across, to prove to the population that it was safe. And 30 years later, he would make this wonderfully modernist picture of the George Washington Bridge. This is just a little tangent, but it's rather interesting. Here, the piers were steel, and they were not covered in concrete to make Gothic. But the design was for Gothic also. Once the engineers built them, they said, no, we have to leave it. It's too beautiful the way it is. Sensibilities were changing. The public perception of what was beautiful was changing. Suddenly, modernism was entering into the public mind as something that could be aesthetically pleasing. So, Steichen as a bridge, if you've seen the little film we have next door, you see him choosing between 2 pictures. He's hiding behind there. And what is the picture he has chosen to show us? The George Washington Bridge. And he chose that backdrop. So again, I think he saw himself also as a bridging figure. Now I'm going to go to a new subject and come back to that question, why did Condé Nast choose this man to become the photographer of fashion? Well, in 1904, he was making fabulous portraits. He had a portrait studio in New York. He imagined himself as being this great portrait photographer, and all the famous people in the world would come to him to have their portraits made. This is Mrs. Philip Leidig. She's a wealthy New York socialite, and she was known for spending $3,000 a month on her flowers, the equivalent of like $50,000 a month on her flowers. And you see the way he's kind of has an equivalent of the eye, the iris of the eye and the iris of the flower. He makes her part of the composition, and she leans right out. She leans right into our space. This was a trick you'll see in all kinds of, voila, you see in all kinds of Steichen pictures here. This is 20 years earlier. This is 20 years before he goes to Condé Nast, or 15 years. Another icon in photography. This is the richest man in the world at this point, J. Pierpont Morgan. And Steichen said, Steichen was a socialist, at least until he started earning a lot of money. He was a socialist. You know, most socialists are like that. And he claims he did not see that this looked like a knife in the hands of the millionaire. But he liked it. Once he saw it, he said, I like it. And he was paid, this is really interesting, he was paid $1,500 for this picture in 1904. So it's like the equivalent of $50,000. You have to multiply by 35, so it's like the equivalent of $50,000 for a young photographer today. Richard Strauss, and again, you see this like this energy. He's like, he looks like Richard Strauss is like jumping out of his chair with energy, just coming forward. But when he photographs women, he's a little more discreet. This woman is not important. She's married to somebody very important. She's married to a naval officer. So you have the picture of the boat up here, the sails, and he's made her dress move in the same way. So he realizes that, remember, this is before feminism. A woman is a decorative object of a man, in the eyes of most men at this period. And she, therefore, is conforming to ideas we have about her husband, who is a naval officer. Then in 1907, he photographs Mrs. Condé Nast. We don't know how it happened, but this means that at this moment, Mr. Condé Nast knows who Steichen is. And again, it's a pictorialist masterpiece. But is it so different from art of the time? Is he an artist who has all his ideas coming from within? I don't think so. This is a painting by a society painter at the time, French, Aimant Jean. And if you put them together, you see a striking similarity. So Steichen was very adept at borrowing. I'm not saying he stole anything, but there's a flavor of the time. And artists like Steichen are always very clever at taking from the flavor or the spirit of the time and doing something new with them. Another artist Steichen thought was fabulous was Eugène Carrière. And Carrière, this is a painting, Carrière was famous for only using one color. And Steichen thought, this is fabulous, that he can express so much sentiment and mood in one color. And for a photographer who works in black and white, this is 1896. This is when he was a teenager. It's called Lady in a Doorway. It's a little bit sometimes hard to see her. See? Lady in a Doorway, shadow. 1896. And if we put them together, you see striking similarities. This is a painting of Sargent, by Sargent, of a wealthy family living in France. Obviously, haute bourgeois, very moneyed. They have objects of great value. I love this sort of modernist element here. It looks like a Calder piece of sculpture. And these are privileged children. Steichen made a portrait of his own family in France. And when you put the two together, you see again a striking similarity in the construction of the picture. And he thought Sargent was fabulous. Steichen went to Paris at the age of 21. The minute he had his birthday, he turned 21, he went to Paris. And he took a bicycle from Le Havre, the seaside harbor, and he drove straight to Paris, where he met Rodin, who was exhibiting in the Paris Salon. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Another painter he met at the time was an American living in Paris called White Alexander. And White Alexander was known for these very mystical, theatrical stagings of vague historical allegories. And Steichen was very influenced by this. This is Steichen's own in memoriam. And this is what happens when we put the two together. And this is another White Alexander. You can see that the love of depicting, he's almost more interested in the fabric than he is in the subject he's photographing. So Steichen gets off the boat, gets on a bicycle, he goes to Paris to the World's Fair. The 1900 World's Fair, or Grand Exhibition. And he goes, this is what he sees when he arrives. This is a 1900 photograph, postcard, of the entrance to the World's Fair. And at the top, you see a woman. And that woman has a name. And her name is La Parisienne. And if any of you are fashion experts, you know La Parisienne is not a real figure. She's like Joan of Arc kind of thing. She's a mythical figure meant to embody the French genius for design and elegance and chic. And you find La Parisienne throughout French art. For example, this painting by Claude Giron, and it is a painting, it looks like a photograph, it's a painting, is called La Parisienne. And it is obviously a woman who never has to use her hands, right? She's too delicate for that. She'd never wash dishes, for example. And she's leaning against the table, young, desirable, and confident, but passive. Steichen, 10 years after he's been at Vogue, he makes this picture. He doesn't call it La Parisienne. I'll come back to that in a moment. But she too is still leaning against some furniture. If you look carefully at the wallpaper, it says Vogue, 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 Vogue. It's not so apparent. And it's a different kind of confidence. This is the new woman who smokes and drives a car. Those are driving gloves. And she probably does use her hands. So Steichen, again, Steichen's photographs are not simply to be labeled as wholly innovative and wholly original and so on. He is using art of the past. He's in Paris. He's going to all the museums. He's meeting as many artists as he can, and he's soaking it up. He loves going to museums. He's soaking up the ideas. And I'd like to just talk to just a tiny bit about fashion in Paris. Fashion magazines, because Vogue is a fashion magazine. Fashion magazines start in the 1600s. The mid-1600s. And when you study them, it's very funny because they don't ever stop during the revolution. It's like the women said, no, revolution, that's for the men. We just want our magazines. And there are new magazines every year. This is 1691. This was the first magazine that started to write about fashion as reportage. And it started to have fashion plates, engravings in it. This looks like something Karl Lagerfeld would do. Often they were extremely colorful. But most often, after a period of exuberance in design, because the first designers, the first graphic artists were at the court. They were court artists. They were very high level, very highly paid, very highly respected, and they made beautiful artworks. But with the spreading of developing of a new middle class, or more, let's say more wealthy people, the fashion designs were toned down a bit. They became quieter, they became more factual, they became less expressive. This is the first real fashion magazine. I've forgotten the exact date, 1780, I think. The first real fashion magazine. And real fashion magazine is very close to Vogue because it told women what they should look like, and it told them where to get the clothes. Here's another fashion plate for the time. And men's fashions, too. When I go to Paris, I dress like that. So if you think the Parisienne is something just from history, let's take a look at this picture. Kate Moss, La Parisienne. So today, we're still playing on this. Everybody knows she's an English girl, so we stick the Eiffel Tower in there just to make sure you understand, you know, that's Paris. So here's another fashion plate. This is 1859, and what the fashion illustrators learned at this point was if you put two women in a picture, you could show what the dress felt like or looked like standing up and sitting down, because mostly women had to sit down. So they had to look good sitting down. So here he's managed both things. She's getting some sheets from music, her music sheets, she's playing the piano, and you have it both ways. So that's 1835, and this is Steichen, 1935. So exactly 100 years later, exactly the same idea, and even the same structure of the image. The same structure of the image. Look at the chair in the corner, for example. Now, I discovered this just looking at things. This isn't Steichen's comparison, it's my comparison. Then in 1909, Condé Nast buys Vogue magazine. It already existed. He buys Vogue magazine. As I mentioned to you earlier, the money is made by selling patterns for women to cut out and stitch together. And there's a painting on the cover. And that painting is by Edwards Steichen. So, remember, he starts this work in 1922. 1909, he's on the cover of Vogue magazine. And he's photographed Mrs. Condé Nast, and actually he's also photographed Condé Nast's daughter. So Condé Nast knows who Mr. Steichen is. And then in 1911, one of the court artists, Georges Lapape, one of the most famous of them, makes this drawing, and it's published in a magazine called Art and Decoration. And 35 years later, Edward Steichen makes this Vogue picture, and I'll put them together. And you see the astonishing similarities. You have this big hat in the corner, you have this big hat in the corner, you have what we call a scalloped mirror, scalloped mirror, scalloped mirror. You have a second mirror there, you have a second mirror there, and you have a central figure, and you have someone sitting at the table. You could say to me, well, that's just a coincidence. But Edward Steichen's photographs were published in the same issue of the magazine. So he would have received that magazine, and he would have seen this photograph. And then, what were his photographs in that magazine? These were the photographs. He was commissioned by Art and Decoration to photograph the creations of Paul Poiret. And if you have some fashion background, you know who he is. He was considered the great modernist couturier of the early part of the 20th century. And the parallels are fascinating between him and Steichen, because Paul Poiret, they were the same age exactly, 3 months difference in their birthdays, same age. They both had weak fathers who tried to discourage them from an art career, and tough mothers who pushed them into an art career. They were both superb colorists. The New York Times called Poiret the modern retina. Paul Poiret is the modern retina. And they both had art galleries. Paul Poiret had his own art gallery where he showed the work of painters he loved. Steichen had 291, the art gallery where he worked with Stieglitz. And they both had magazines, camera work for Steichen, and a beautiful magazine, beautifully printed by Paul Poiret. So this is 1911. So it's full 10 years before he would go to Vogue. He does about 10 of these pictures, and then he stops. He does no more fashion. He shows no interest. In everything he's written, he never writes anything, Steichen never writes anything about these pictures other than he says they are the first serious fashion photographs. So again, Condé Nast, who buys every French magazine, is seeing Steichen again. And here's another of the masterpieces. Certainly, if you had to pick 10 of the best, the best 10 photographs in the history of fashion photography, this would have to be one of them. And this is the first where you are seeing fashion not on a mannequin, because that existed already, but you're seeing fashion as it was meant to be worn. And it looks completely believable. You think, these women must live like that. It's a masterpiece also of Chinese influence, or Chinese, Japanese, Asian influence, the structure of the image, the negative space. The arm out here, this diagonal, which, if you look at the three arms, you have this fantastic game of diagonals. These are the kinds of things you see around you here as well. But it's still shot in the pictorialist manner. And I should add on that theme, Paul Poiret said, I want to in my work, the detail is suppressed in favor of the overall feel of my dresses. And that's exactly what the pictorialists were saying. The detail was suppressed in favor of the feel, the atmosphere. Just think of Heinrich Kuhn. The pictorialist idea was atmosphere, not detail. And here we have a picture by Ingres, a painter Steichen studied, knew all about. This is an aristocrat. And here you have a Steichen of another aristocrat. And you see that he's using absolutely conventional kinds of approaches to photography. This is Kees van Dongen. Kees van Dongen was a society portraitist, I think, originally Dutch, I think, but he was living in Paris, and he was extremely successful. All the fancy men and women wanted to have a portrait by Kees van Dongen. And this is Steichen, which is influenced by Mondrian and constructivism. And this is Christian Schad, You know his work well, as he is a neighbor of yours. And this is Steichen. So this was an influence which was coming from the cinema, the blow-up, the close-up. The close-up was found, still today, the close-up was found to have this tremendous power, especially when it was projected on a cinema screen, monumental size. Even today, that's why, you know, if Angelina Jolie walked through the door, you'd all go crazy, right? I'd go crazy too. I would forget. We'd go, ah! That'd be the end of the lecture. Angelina Jolie, oh my God, right? And it starts with cinema. You don't have that fever about celebrity until you have cinema. And now it's only heightened and heightened and heightened by repetition. And you don't have this kind of, there's the original, by the way. You don't have this kind of tight, compressive composition before you have the art of the cinema. And Steichen, as you remember, was thinking about going into film. This is Ingres again. And this is Steichen, portrait of Winston Churchill. And this is the two of them together. And through the show, you will see this capacity to photograph the importance of the hand, and of course, the position of the head, and the torque of the body. You know, Churchill, both of them are not seen like this. They're angled. Painters understand all that. And painters understand light. I mean, if you look at this is a painted effect. A painted effect. And Steichen has done exactly the same thing here. So he has a very strong light on the face, but he also has a light behind to give this definition, and he has a light on the fingers. Over and over you see this. It's a wonderful exercise for students just to go around and look at the hands. This is another Christian Schad picture of a woman in a bar. And you have all that kind of, those modernist decorative elements. I mean, even today it looks modern, right? Even today it looks new and flashy. You could imagine such a bar in New York or Berlin or Vienna today, and it would still look pretty exciting. New reflective materials, you know, use of glass in a totally new way, use of industrial materials in a new aesthetic way. And Steichen and the two together. But Steichen didn't just take from the art of his time. Steichen also was extremely interested in art going back to the Renaissance. And here is a painting by Parmigianino, something like that. Can never say it right. From 1535. And here's Steichen in 1935. 400 years later. And that was my little joke of making her look as though she's looking at her friend from 400 years earlier. But you can see that it's still the same basic approach to portraiture. So that's the end of what I'd like to show you. I did want to show you one picture, which I don't have in my slideshow, which I think you can see when I hold it up, of Steichen on his bicycle going to Paris. I was so excited when I found this photograph, because, you know, he tells the story in his book, but we had no idea that there was actually a picture of him on the bike. It's a bit of kind of self-promotion. So that's the end of my talk, actually. I'm quite happy to stick around and talk about specific photographs, or take a few photographs and talk about them informally if you'd like. And perhaps you have some questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Shall we take a few questions, if there are?
Genau, wenn Sie Fragen haben, würde ich Ihnen das Mikrofon überreichen.
You don't have to have a question.
I have a question that is maybe not so at the point of fashion, but I'm interested in his plant breeding program.
Oh.
And I would like to know, I mean, he was photographing so much, and I don't know so many pictures of the plant he breeds. So do you know if there are more photos?
Yeah, there are quite a few pictures. We actually thought of doing a show about his flowers. First of all, he grew all these different kinds of flowers. Already in 1911 in France, he won a medal, and for an iris called Mr. Steichen. It even had a name. He won a medal from the French Horticultural Society. He kept it up. The war, of course, ruined his gardens. So he abandoned France and he bought a new farm. When he had this position, he bought a farm in Connecticut and started again. And I kind of skimmed over one of the facts I mentioned. He had a show of his flowers in New York. And apparently that was quite a battle, because there were people in the museum who did not want him to have that show, because they felt it was not correct to show. Flowers weren't serious. They couldn't be an art form. But he maintained that they were an art form, and he said, all right, I'll pay for the whole thing myself. So he brought in 1,500 flowers at a time. Every 3 days he changed them. And the show, I think, was up for 2 weeks. So that was, the Museum of Modern Art had never shown nature, living nature as an art form before. And I think since, they've only done it once with Robert Morris. There's a work where they're living plant forms. So his flowers then became a kind of business, but I think he was always distracted. So after this period, when he leaves, he basically leaves because he gets bored. He stays at Condé Nast for 15 years. He gets bored. He decides to go to his flowers. But then the war breaks out, and he feels that he has to join the war effort. So again, he puts the flowers aside. And then after the war, the Museum of Modern Art asks him to be the director of the photography department. And that's kind of fascinating, because he's 68 years old. So most men at 68 do not consider, taking on a new job with a lot of responsibility. He says, sure. And he stays there for 15 years. But now he does do his flowers. He keeps but he can never really develop it into the commercial operation he wants, because he doesn't have the time. And then he's too old. He's too old. So he might have been simply that, and we would never have heard of him again after 1935. But because he stayed in photography, especially because of the great exhibition, The Family of Man, which he did in 1955, which was probably the most viewed photography exhibition ever in history. 19 million people saw it around the world. It traveled to, 92 countries, I think, and 90 million people saw it, and you can still see it today in Luxembourg as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's the only exhibition that has this status of UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the flowers, I think, just never, could get enough time, his time. But you could do a beautiful show. When he was younger, he said he likes flowers better than people because they don't talk back to you and they don't make trouble, He actually said that. Any other comments or thoughts?
I have a question.
Yes.
You can see that everything is very carefully staged and
Yes.
very refined, in a very refined way. Is there any information how long it has taken him to make such a photograph? Or a portrait of Churchill? I'm sure Churchill was very busy, so he...
Yeah, sometimes they were given, there's a lot of myth about fashion photographs. And the fashion photographers, they play on that myth, like Jürgen Teller and Patrick de Marchelier. They play on this myth, and we kind of like that too. They become stars too, right? But they also work very, very hard. And Steichen went to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, most days, and he was told on that morning he was photographing this dress. And he had to, even if he had too much to drink the night before, he had to do that dress that morning. If you look at the film next door, you see he had 3 electricians, at least 3 electricians. And if you've seen the film, has everybody seen the film? Not yet. If you look very sharply, at one point you see 3 women in the background. Just for a second, 3 women. And they were the editors. So the fashion editor, the editor-in-chief, and the accessories editor, jewelry, hair, and so on. So they were there also. So, the studio was about this big. So, he had those 3 women, he had his 5 electricians and so on, he had to do something. And he didn't always have ideas. And often he just took these panels here, you see these panels? He just flipped them on their side. I guess I don't have a picture here. He put them like this, he put them like that. He used them in many, many different ways. And he brought in pieces of furniture like this Art Deco chair. Sometimes he went outside the studio. He went to Hollywood once a year. So he got to go into people's homes and things. Sometimes he used Condé Nast's apartment, which was very chic. It was the first penthouse apartment in New York. And Condé Nast started the fashion for having fancy events in the penthouse, which now you have in James Bond films and the penthouse. You have to be really rich to have a penthouse. But even here you see these with this picture of Martha Graham. Again, he uses just one of these panels, and he uses it as a kind of totem. So he didn't have so much to work with. Condé Nast insisted they do most of the work in the studio. So that means you couldn't have motion because the film was too slow. So anytime you have motion, it's acted. It's the dancers are like this, because you couldn't actually photograph any movement. So he was incredibly creative with very few devices, and one of them was lighting, because you can always move the lighting around. There's another Churchill picture. So he's used the panel. Look at the panel. Here's the panel splitting the picture in 2. That's a device he often uses. Again here. Here he's turned it sideways. Here he's turned it vertically. But the same elements, and then lighting. And with lighting, you can do fabulous things. You can do fabulous things. And he used the expression, he said, light is a charlatan. Like, you can't trust it. You have to, it's like a genie. You work with it and you try to control it, but it doesn't really. So there are accidents with light, and you have to accept them. Because if you move the light a little bit, it changes everything. Often, Roland Barthes uses this phrase, punctum, for if there's like something really small in a picture that catches your eye, you know, gives it the force. Steichen was a master of the punctum, this little, the light off a fingernail or something like that in a corner that would just animate the picture. I find every time I give a tour of this show, I see something new. And just yesterday, talking to the press, I saw that photograph of the two women, and I realized it was almost this one here, the two women, one's lighting a cigarette of the other. It was almost an exact structural copy of the picture I showed you from 1911 of the two Poiret dresses. So he's even stealing from himself. And you have to do that. If you have to turn out this stuff every day, there are 2,000 prints in the Condé Nast archive. These 200 here, there are 2,000 in the archive. So he was just extremely productive. He was driven. You know, he was one of those workaholics, I think. And fashion seems to need those people.
Is there some information how many slides he used until he...
About 5 or 6 for each, sometimes more if he wasn't satisfied. In this case, this is a good example. The Steichen, the Churchill I showed you there, this is a different one. Sometimes we chose one that wasn't published. We thought it was just as interesting because he didn't necessarily choose the one to be published. This could also be the editors or the art director. So no, this works better. And sometimes they were flipped, and sometimes they were cropped. So we made the decision to show you the public, the full image every time. So maybe in the magazine they did this, you know. But we made a show not about magazines, we made a show about a photographer. So you have magazines, you can see what they look like, but this is really about the photography. And every picture here is a contact print. So photographers knows what that means, but if you're not a photographer, you don't. It means the negative is the same size. So you take the negative and you put the paper on it and you shine light through the negative onto the paper. So that's why you have this fantastic detail. This fantastic, because the negative is so, it's not 35 millimeter that you blow up. That's the size of the negative. So the information is fabulous. And then in this period, there was more silver in the paper. Because you know a photograph is made from silver salt, which turns dark with light. The manufacturers had more silver in the paper. So it's much richer. So already by 1950, 1960, the papers are much grayer, you know, they're not as rich. If you make a new print from the negative and you put it beside it, you hate it. You have to have the original. So these are all original prints right from the Condé Nast archive, and they were never seen. And the reason they were never seen is nobody had any interest in them, because it's not art, it's commerce. They were work prints. And we had a debate earlier today, what would Steichen have felt about this exhibition? Would he have liked it? I don't know. He might have said, Mr. Ewing, you've killed my reputation, or, you know, I don't know. Because a lot of these pictures were not in the magazine, they were not published. Because Vogue, all those fashion magazines, they take many, many more photographs than they can use, right? They only publish a tiny amount of the pictures that are taken every month. So maybe he would be embarrassed by some of these pictures, but I like to work with dead photographers because they can't complain. So I think that's it. I hope that has inspired some of the photographers here to go out and make great photographs.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much.